What if the greatest love story of the 20th century was actually a cover for one of the most dangerous conspiracies in British history? On December 11, 1936, King Edward VIII stood before microphones and delivered one of the most famous speeches ever broadcast. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." The world wept. A king had given up his throne for love, choosing romance over duty, passion over power. It was the ultimate fairy tale, tragic and beautiful. But what if the real story wasn't about love at all? What if Edward VIII didn't sacrifice his crown for Wallis Simpson? What if the British establishment forced him out because they discovered he was a Nazi sympathizer who planned to betray his country to Adolf Hitler? This is the story of the king who almost destroyed Britain, the American divorcee who captured his heart, and the conspiracy that's been hidden for nearly a century. The story begins not with abdication, but with a prince who never wanted to be king. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, known to his family as David, was born on June 23, 1894, the eldest son of the future King George V. From birth, he was heir to the British Empire, the largest empire in human history, stretching across a quarter of the globe. But Edward was a reluctant prince. He chafed against royal protocol, hated the stiffness of court life, and rebelled against his stern, demanding father. George V believed in duty above all else. Edward believed in pleasure. The clash was inevitable. As a young man, Edward was wildly popular. Handsome, charming, modern in his tastes, he represented a new generation of royalty. Less formal, more accessible, interested in jazz and fashion and breaking social conventions. He toured the British Empire in the 1920s, drawing massive crowds wherever he went. Women adored him. The press celebrated him as the people's prince. But behind the public image, Edward had a problem. He fell in love with married women. Lots of them. His affairs scandalized the palace. His father despaired. And in 1934, at age 40, Edward met the woman who would destroy his life, Wallis Simpson. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born on June 19, 1896, in Pennsylvania, into a family that had once been wealthy but had fallen on hard times. She married young, divorced, married again to Ernest Simpson, a British-American businessman, and moved to London in the early 1930s. Wallis was not conventionally beautiful, thin, angular, with a sharp wit and sharper tongue. But she had something more dangerous than beauty. She knew how to make powerful men feel understood. And Edward, lonely and insecure despite his royal status, fell completely under her spell. Their affair began in 1934. Edward showered her with jewels, money, and attention. He introduced her to his social circle. He brought her to royal events, even though she was married. The British aristocracy was scandalized but powerless. Edward was the Prince of Wales and would soon be king. In January 1936, King George V died. On his deathbed, he reportedly said, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." George V knew his son. He knew Edward lacked the character, the discipline, the sense of duty required to be king. And he knew about Wallis Simpson. His prediction would prove tragically accurate. Edward ascended the throne on January 20, 1936, as King Edward VIII. He was 41 years old and determined to marry Wallis Simpson, who was still married to Ernest. The problem was constitutional and moral. The King of England was also the supreme governor of the Church of England, which did not recognize divorce. A king could not marry a divorced woman, especially not a woman who'd been divorced twice and whose ex-husbands were still living. It was unthinkable. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin explained this to Edward clearly. "You can be king, or you can marry Wallis Simpson, but you cannot do both." Edward didn't care. He wanted Wallis. He demanded the government allow the marriage. Baldwin refused. Edward threatened to abdicate. Baldwin called his bluff. For months, the crisis simmered. The British press, operating under a gentleman's agreement with the palace, said nothing. The American and European press had no such restrictions. They reported gleefully on the king's scandalous affair. The British public knew something was happening but not exactly what. And all the while, Edward was making decisions that terrified his advisors for reasons that had nothing to do with romance. Because here's what the official story doesn't tell you. Edward VIII was a Nazi sympathizer. Not secretly, not subtly.
Openly, enthusiastically, dangerously pro-Nazi.
And the British government knew it. In the 1930s, as Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, many in the British aristocracy admired him. They saw him as a bulwark against communism. They appreciated his authoritarianism, his nationalism, his promises to restore Germany's greatness. Some even shared his anti-Semitism. But most British aristocrats kept these views private. Edward did not. Edward met Adolf Hitler in October 1937, nearly a year after his abdication, during a highly publicized visit to Germany. Photographs show Edward and Wallis, now the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, giving Nazi salutes, dining with high-ranking Nazis, touring factories producing weapons for the coming war. Edward met Hitler at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, and the two men spoke for over an hour. Witnesses reported that Edward was impressed, even deferential. Hitler, who rarely praised anyone, later called Edward a logical man who understood Germany's position. The visit caused outrage in Britain and confirmed what many had suspected. Edward was not just sympathetic to the Nazis, he was their friend. But the relationship had begun much earlier. Declassified documents from German, British, and American archives reveal that Edward had been in contact with Nazi officials as early as 1933. He met with German Ambassador Leopold von Husch repeatedly. He expressed admiration for Hitler's leadership. He argued that Britain and Germany should be allies, not enemies. Most damningly, he opposed British rearmament and supported appeasement, the policy of giving Hitler what he wanted to avoid war. When British intelligence began monitoring Edward's communications, they discovered he was sharing sensitive information with German contacts. The future King of England was functionally a Nazi asset. Wallis Simpson shared his views. She'd spent time in China in the 1920s and had an affair with a fascist Italian diplomat. She was openly anti-Semitic, referring to Jews with slurs in private letters. She and Edward attended parties hosted by Nazi sympathizers in London. They socialized with Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists. And when Edward became king, Wallis encouraged his pro-German stance, seeing it as a path to peace and to her own social elevation. The British establishment watched in horror. They had a king who sympathized with their future enemy. And he was about to marry a woman who reinforced his worst instincts. This is where the abdication crisis becomes something more than a love story. Yes, Edward could not marry a divorced woman and remain king. That was the official reason. But behind closed doors, Prime Minister Baldwin and the security services had another concern. They needed Edward off the throne before he could do real damage. If war came, and it was increasingly clear war would come, Britain could not have a Nazi-sympathizing king. Edward might refuse to support the war effort. He might leak intelligence to Germany. He might even advocate for surrender. The constitutional crisis over Wallis Simpson gave them the perfect excuse to force him out. So when Edward demanded to marry Wallis, Baldwin said no. When Edward proposed a morganatic marriage, where Wallis would be his wife but not queen, Baldwin said no. When Edward threatened to abdicate, Baldwin essentially said, "Please do." The establishment wanted him gone. The Church of England's position on divorce gave them moral cover. But the real reason was treason, not romance. On December 10, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. The next day, he broadcast his famous speech. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility," he said, voice trembling with emotion. The world heard a man sacrificing everything for love. The British government heard a problem solving itself. Edward's younger brother became King George VI, a shy, stammering man who never expected to be king but who proved to be exactly what Britain needed during World War II. Edward and Wallis, now the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, left Britain. They married in France in June 1937 at a ceremony no member of the royal family attended. The palace stripped Wallis of the title Her Royal Highness, a deliberate insult that Edward never forgave. They were exiled, persona non grata in Britain. The official reason was Edward's abdication. The real reason was his politics. And then the war began. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. Edward, living in France, suddenly became a security risk. If the Germans captured him, they could use him as a puppet king. If he defected, he could broadcast propaganda. The British government needed him somewhere safe and irrelevant. So they offered him the governorship of the Bahamas, a tiny, unimportant colonial post thousands of miles from the war. It was exile disguised as an appointment. Edward, insulted but with no alternatives, accepted. But before Edward could reach the Bahamas, Nazis made their move. In summer 1940, as France fell to German invasion, Edward and Wallis fled to Spain, then to Portugal, both neutral countries with Nazi sympathies. German intelligence saw an opportunity. Operation Willi was conceived. A plan to kidnap Edward, take him to Germany, and install him as a puppet king after Britain's defeat. The plan was supported at the highest levels of the Nazi regime. Hitler himself authorized it. German agents approached Edward in Portugal with a proposal. Stay in Europe, and when Germany wins, you'll be restored to the British throne. Wallis will be queen. You'll have everything you wanted. What happened next is one of the most closely guarded secrets in British history. Did Edward seriously consider the Nazi offer? Declassified documents suggest he did. He delayed his departure for the Bahamas for weeks, making excuses. He met with German agents. He expressed doubts about Britain's chances of winning the war. British intelligence, monitoring the situation, panicked. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, sent urgent, threatening telegrams. Get on the ship to the Bahamas immediately or face consequences. Finally, in August 1940, Edward and Wallis boarded the ship. Operation Willi was aborted. But the damage to Edward's reputation within the British government was catastrophic and permanent. For the rest of the war, Edward served as governor of the Bahamas, a post he hated and performed poorly. He complained constantly. He demanded special treatment. He made racist comments about the local population. Meanwhile, his brother George VI became a national hero, staying in London during the Blitz, visiting bombed-out neighborhoods, refusing to send his daughters to safety in Canada. "The children won't go without me," Queen Elizabeth said. "I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave." The contrast between the two brothers was stark. One stayed and fought. The other fled and sulked. After the war ended in 1945, Edward hoped to return to Britain and resume some role in public life. The palace refused. The royal family had not forgiven him, not for the abdication, not for marrying Wallis, and especially not for his wartime behavior. Declassified files from British intelligence reveal that they had extensive evidence of Edward's contacts with Nazi agents, including intercepted correspondence. They considered prosecuting him for treason but decided it would damage the monarchy too badly. Instead, they chose permanent exile. Edward and Wallis were allowed to visit Britain occasionally, but they were never welcomed back. They spent the rest of their lives in France, living off Edward's allowance from his family and the money from selling his memoirs. The 1950s and 60s were lonely decades for the Windsors. Edward played golf, gardened, and wrote bitter letters complaining about his treatment. Wallis threw parties, collected jewelry, and drank heavily. They had no children. They had few real friends. The Duke of Windsor, as he was now styled, had given up the throne of the British Empire for a woman, and they ended up with nothing but each other and their regrets. In 1966, Edward was finally invited to attend the unveiling of a memorial to his mother, Queen Mary. It was the first time he'd been invited to a royal event in 30 years. He wept when he saw his family again. But there was no reconciliation. The wounds were too deep. Wallis outlived Edward by 14 years. After his death from throat cancer in 1972, she descended into dementia, cared for by nurses in their Paris home. She saw no one. The royal family made no effort to visit her. When she died in 1986, Her funeral was attended by the royal family out of duty, not affection. She was buried beside Edward at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle, the closest they ever came to being fully accepted back into the fold. Even in death, they were kept at a distance. But the real scandal wasn't revealed until after Wallis's death, when historians gained access to sealed archives. The full extent of Edward's Nazi sympathies and wartime betrayal became public. Documents showed that Edward had passed information to German contacts about British troop movements. He'd discussed plans for a negotiated peace that would leave Hitler in control of Europe. He'd accepted money from Nazi sources. Most shockingly, telegrams revealed that Edward had told German diplomats he hoped Britain would lose the war quickly so that a reasonable peace could be arranged, with him potentially restored to the throne. These revelations destroyed what remained of Edward's reputation. The romantic narrative of a king who gave up everything for love collapsed. The truth was uglier. A weak, vain man who sympathized with fascists, who was willing to betray his country for personal ambition, and who was quietly removed from power by a government that understood the danger he represented. The abdication wasn't a love story. It was a cover-up. The Church of England's position on divorce gave the establishment the excuse they needed to get rid of a king who threatened national security. Consider the evidence. Edward's own letters and diaries, released decades after his death, confirm his Nazi sympathies. He blamed Jews for the war. He admired Hitler's strength. He thought democracy was weak. German archives, opened after reunification, contained detailed records of Operation Willi and Edward's meetings with Nazi agents. FBI files, released under Freedom of Information requests, show that American intelligence also monitored Edward and concluded he was a Nazi sympathizer. Even members of his own family, in private letters, expressed relief that he abdicated before the war. Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, wrote that Edward's departure was providential because David would have ruined everything. The question that divides historians is this: how much did the British government know before the abdication, and did they engineer it? The official story is that the abdication was about marriage and the church. But the timeline suggests otherwise. Baldwin and the security services began distancing themselves from Edward in early 1936, months before the abdication crisis peaked. They had reports of his Nazi contacts. They knew he was unreliable. When the Wallis Simpson crisis erupted, they may have seen it as the perfect opportunity. They refused any compromise, pushed him toward abdication, and accepted it immediately when he offered. It's possible the abdication crisis was a convenient accident. But it's equally possible it was a calculated move to remove a dangerous king before he could do real harm. And here's the conspiracy that really keeps people up at night. What if Wallis Simpson was a Nazi agent? There's no definitive proof, but the circumstantial evidence is intriguing. Wallis had connections to German and Italian diplomats before she met Edward. She encouraged his pro-Nazi views. She was present at meetings with German officials. After the war, British intelligence files noted that she'd been suspiciously close to Axis sympathizers. Some historians speculate that German intelligence deliberately placed her in Edward's path, knowing his weakness for strong-willed women and hoping to influence him. Others dismiss this as conspiracy theory, arguing that Wallis was simply an opportunistic social climber who shared Edward's politics but wasn't actively working for Germany. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between. Wallis may not have been a formal agent, but she certainly played a role in reinforcing Edward's worst instincts. Let's talk about what would have happened if Edward had remained king during World War II. If the abdication hadn't occurred, and Britain entered the war with Edward VIII on the throne, the consequences could have been catastrophic. A king who sympathized with Germany could have undermined the war effort in countless ways. He could have delayed mobilization. He could have opposed Churchill's appointment as prime minister. He could have advocated for a negotiated peace after Dunkirk, when Britain stood alone against Hitler. He could have leaked intelligence to Germany, either deliberately or through carelessness. At minimum, he would have been a propaganda disaster. Imagine Nazi broadcasts featuring the King of England expressing sympathy for Germany. At worst, he could have facilitated a coup or defection. The British establishment understood this. That's why they got rid of him. Compare Edward to his brother George VI. George was never supposed to be king. He was shy, he stuttered, he lacked confidence. But when thrust into the role, he rose to it. He stayed in London during the bombing. He visited troops. He supported Churchill. He became a symbol of British resilience. His wife, Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, was equally courageous. Their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, stayed in Britain despite danger. The royal family became a rallying point for national morale. If Edward had been king, none of that would have happened. He would have fled at the first sign of danger. He'd already proven that in 1940. Britain needed a king who embodied courage and duty. Edward embodied neither. The abdication also had profound effects on the current royal family. Edward's niece, Princess Elizabeth, was 10 years old when her uncle abdicated. Suddenly, her father was king, and she was heir to the throne. Her entire life changed in an instant. She later said the abdication taught her that duty must always come before personal happiness. When she became Queen Elizabeth II in 1952, she dedicated herself to that principle. She would never abdicate, never put personal feelings above the institution, never make the mistakes her uncle made. Her reign of 70 years was defined by that commitment. The abdication cast a long shadow. It also explains the royal family's treatment of Wallis. For decades, the Queen Mother, George VI's widow, refused to speak to or about Wallis. She blamed Wallis for forcing the abdication that thrust her shy husband into a role he never wanted and that she believed shortened his life. George VI died young, at 56, from lung cancer and stress-related illness. His widow believed the strain of being king during the war had killed him, and she blamed Edward and Wallis. The Queen Mother's hatred of Wallis was legendary. When Edward died and Wallis asked if she could live in Britain, the Queen Mother blocked it. When Wallis died, the Queen Mother attended the funeral only because protocol demanded it. The personal animosity lasted until the Queen Mother's own death in 2002. In recent years, as more documents have been declassified, the debate about Edward VIII has intensified. Some historians argue he's been unfairly vilified, that his Nazi sympathies were typical of his class and time, that his wartime indiscretions were minor, that he genuinely loved Wallis and should be remembered as a romantic figure who chose love over duty. Others argue he got off easy, that he committed treason, that he should have been prosecuted, that the cover-up protected the monarchy at the expense of justice. The truth, as usual, is complicated. Edward was both a romantic fool and a potential traitor. His abdication was both a love story and a national security operation. What remains undeniable is that the abdication changed British history. If Edward had remained king, Britain might have lost World War II. At minimum, the war would have been far more difficult. The abdication removed a weak, compromised king and replaced him with a man who, despite his limitations, embodied the courage Britain needed. It also demonstrated that the British establishment was willing to sacrifice even a king to protect the nation. Edward thought he was indispensable. He learned he was not. The irony is that Edward's abdication probably saved the monarchy. If he'd remained king during the war and his Nazi sympathies had become fully public, the scandal could have destroyed the institution. Instead, he left quietly. The official story emphasized romance over treason, and his brother restored the monarchy's reputation. By the time the full truth emerged decades later, Edward was long dead and the royal family was secure. The cover-up worked. The institution survived. And the king who would have destroyed it was safely exiled in France, remembered as a romantic fool rather than a traitor. Today, tourists visit Windsor Castle and see Edward VIII's portrait hanging alongside other monarchs. He reigned for just 326 days, the shortest reign of any British monarch who completed their coronation ceremony. Most visitors know only the romantic version, the king who gave up his throne for love. They don't know about the Nazi salutes, the meetings with Hitler, Operation Willi, or the telegrams hoping Britain would lose the war. That story remains obscure, buried in archives and academic books. The official narrative, romance and sacrifice, is simpler and more palatable. But it's also a lie. Perhaps the real conspiracy is the one we've already mentioned. a deliberate rewriting of history to protect the monarchy. Edward's treason was minimized, his Nazi sympathies downplayed, his wartime behavior excused as eccentricity. The royal family cooperated in this whitewashing because admitting the full truth would have damaged the institution. The British government cooperated because prosecuting a former king for treason would have been politically explosive. And so the lie became the official story, repeated so often that most people believe it. The king who loved too much. The woman who stole a crown.
A tragique romance.
It's a beautiful story. It's also mostly false. On a quiet estate in Paris in June 1972, the Duke of Windsor died of throat cancer, aged 77. His last words were reportedly, "Mama, Mama." Not Wallis. Not his mother Queen Mary, who'd been dead for 20 years. Just Mama. A final regression to childhood, to the time before duty and crowns and terrible choices. Wallis sat beside him, aged and bitter, her beauty long faded, her social ambitions reduced to nothing. The woman he'd given up a throne for. The woman who'd encouraged his worst instincts. The woman he'd loved with a desperation that destroyed his life. Was it worth it? He never answered that question publicly. But the evidence suggests he knew the answer. The abdication of Edward VIII was sold to the world as the greatest love story of the 20th century. A king who gave up everything for the woman he loved. It's the story we want to believe because it's romantic and tragic and affirms that love conquers all. But the truth is darker and more interesting. Edward VIII was forced from the throne because he was a Nazi sympathizer who threatened Britain's survival. The love story was a cover. The real story was treason, conspiracy, and a government that acted decisively to remove a dangerous king before he could do irreparable harm. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing. That the British establishment pulled it off so smoothly that even today, most people believe the fairy tale instead of the truth. History is written by the victors. And in this case, the victors wanted you to believe in romance. But now you know what really happened. The king who would have betrayed Britain. The American woman who helped push him toward it. And the abdication that saved a nation by removing a traitor from the throne. Edward VIII didn't sacrifice his crown for love. He lost it because he chose the wrong side in the coming war. Everything else is just the story they told to make it sound better. Thank you for watching this investigation into one of the most successful cover-ups in royal history. If this video changed how you see the abdication, if you realized the greatest love story was actually the greatest lie, please give it a like so others can discover the truth that was hidden for 80 years. Share this with anyone who thinks they know the Edward VIII story, or anyone interested in how governments rewrite history to protect institutions. Subscribe to Crown Conspiracies and hit that bell. We're uncovering the secrets that shaped history, from medieval mysteries to modern scandals. Your support ensures these hidden truths finally see the light. What's your verdict? Was Edward VIII a romantic fool or a Nazi traitor? Did the establishment save Britain by removing him, or did they cover up treason to protect the monarchy? Should the full truth have been revealed decades ago? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read everyone. Coming next. The princes in the tower, were two royal children murdered by their uncle, or did they escape and live in hiding? Medieval mystery meets royal conspiracy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.